So this is my Plague Mother Oraxia setup. It is a build that relies on one of the weirder interactions in Warframe with a subsuming cold elemental ward onto Oraxia, melee influence, Diriga your Sentinel, Oraxia's Spinnerex passive, and helped along with the Sobek and acid shells. Now a few days ago I had Oraxia footage in the background of my Just Use Everything video, and since then a lot of you have been asking what the feck the setup was that I was using, so here we are. Now, it is worth saying that this is not a new player-friendly build. I will include a more basic Oraxia build in the video later on, but this version is expensive and needs a lot of pieces all working together. Also, a huge shout out to Ignis T on YouTube for bringing this setup to light months ago, just right after Oraxia was released. They showcased some of the best ability and weapon interactions in Warframe, so definitely go and check them out because their videos are amazing. Now, I've changed parts of it to fit how I like to play, which is always something you should do when looking up build guides for Warframe. Adjust it to fit your own playstyle. Now, the first part of this setup is Cold Elemental Ward. Elemental Ward changes depending on your Warframe's emission colour. For this build, you're going to need Cold, so you're going to need to set your emission colour to whatever gives you that version, whether it's white or black and so on. Cold Elemental Ward will boost your Warframe's armour. I think it boosts my Oraxia by over 400%, which allows me to use Arcane Persistence. But the main reason we use it is because it reflects incoming bullets and projectiles back at enemies, converting that damage into cold. So enemies get hit by cold. So enemies shoot you, the damage gets reflected back, and they start getting covered in cold status effects, which then, of course, cold slows enemies down. It does stack quite quickly, and eventually, once it's fully stacked, it will lock enemies in place. Now, the important part here is that those reflected shots from Cold Elemental Ward also count as melee attacks and secondary attacks, but I'll focus on melee for now. It is a super weird interaction for Elemental Ward, but it has been around for the longest of times. That means that they can interact with melee passives and melee arcanes. This is where melee influence comes into the build. Once melee influence activates, the cold status from those reflected shots can spread to nearby enemies, and instead of freezing one enemy bit by bit, the whole room can start freezing into one large chunk, which means those enemies basically get stopped in their tracks and can't move. Now, to trigger melee influence, you're going to need an electric status, and normally you do this with your melee weapon. But because Elemental Ward, the Cold Elemental Ward, counts as a melee interaction, all you need to do is trick melee influence to activating, and then those melee attacks will spread all elements to enemies in a radius. Now, to trigger melee influence, Diriga has an ability called Electro Pulse. This will apply the electric status in order to trick melee influence into activating, and once it activates, it will spread status like the cold elements all across the room, and especially if you're using the mod Shivering Contagion also on your Sentinel, it will allow those cold procs to stack up much faster. If Diriga dies, however, you're going to lose all momentum, and the, reliability of melee influence triggering will go away, which means your build becomes a lot weaker. So the first part is pretty simple. Cold Ward reflects your bullets, Diriga triggers melee influence. Melee influence will spread those reflected cold procs to loads of enemies. Shivering Contagion will amplify that, and the whole room will start to freeze. Then we bring in Oraxia's Spinnerex melee weapon. Now the Spinnerex matters because of its passive. That's pretty much it, okay? Enemies hit by the Spinnerex and then killed by any source have a 10% chance per toxic stack to explode and spread toxin damage. So the more toxin stacks that you put on enemies, the more consistent those explosions become, and because the reflected shots from Cold Ward can count as melee damage, they can also tag enemies for the Spinnerex, and now you have cold spreading through melee influence and you have toxic spreading through the Spinnerex. Enemies are frozen in place, they're covered in status, and once they start dying, those chain reaction explosions will begin. Now I am also using secondary fortifier on my secondary weapon as an arcane, because whenever Xmas units will have their damage reflected back on themselves, it can give you small chunks of overguard, which gives you overguard gate, which is an extra layer of survivability, which is always just nice to have. Now, on top of all of this, because there is a lot going on with this build right now, you also have Oraxia in her ultimate Silken Stride all of the time. This will make her much tankier, much harder to kill, but it will also make her imbue her weapons with toxin damage and cause enemies to also explode from the ultimate with toxin damage as well. So that's two forms of toxic explosions you have. So you have a very tanky frame that can instantly heal by recasting her fort in less than a second. So if you get low on health, simply hit your 4 again, and you're straight back up to full health. You have melee influence, spreading cold and toxin. You have weapons amplified by toxin from her fort ability. You have Spinnerex causing explosions because elemental ward is tricking it into doing melee tagging. Her silken stride is also causing its own explosions. Her webbed embrace will also spread toxin while making enemies immobile and not able to move. It also applies a vulnerability to enemies caught with webbed embrace, which means more potent toxins and of course more potent or bigger explosions. And to top all of this off, we've decided to add the Sobek into the mix as well, because we already have two forms of toxic explosions with the Spinnerex's passive and with her silken stride, I guess, explosions. Why not add in acid shells as well to make a third? Because then we're going to have more explosions, and what's better in Warframe than overkill? Now, once one enemy dies, Spinnerex will spread toxin. Sobex can then help kill more enemies, but it can also apply more toxin, and of course it can trigger more explosions quicker, and the whole room starts chaining really quick. And once it starts going, it gets very stupid very quickly. But again, this is a very expensive setup. It needs a lot of working parts to work properly, and it is not something I would recommend to try for a new player. Now, if you're relatively new to Warframe, or more so to Oraxia, and you don't have a lot of the Archon mods, Prime mods, Umbral mods and so on in order to make the build that I'm going to be showcasing actually work, then this is pretty much the default go-to build for a lot of new players in Warframe. You want an even balance of stats and a bit of survivability until you can get the mods simply by playing the game that little bit longer and farming them up. Now, instead of Equilibrium, if you don't have that, you could put Streamline in here just to give you a bit more of efficiency until you would get a build something along the lines like this, where you would be able to put Subsume on for one of your abilities to give you that, I guess, viral proc from all of your spiders, because they'd have that as well, while also increasing their damage and increasing their, I guess, speed, while also increasing your ability strength off the back of those minions. But that's not what we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to be focusing on an Ice Elemental Ward. So this is my Elemental Ward Oraxia. Now, my Elemental Ward, my Ice version, gives me a bonus of 421% armor, which allows persistence to kick in because I'm above the 700, which means I no longer have a shield. I think with my Silken Stride, my health goes up to about 10,000 once growing power, and that kicks in. However, you could get rid of Molt Augmented for Arcane Blessing if you wanted her health to sit at around 12,000 or 12,500. Again, entirely up to you. When it comes to your aura, if you wanted, you could put Corrosive Projection in here or Brief Respite. I've gone for Growing Power because I want a little bit more power strength. But again, if you're happy with 291 power strength, you could switch any of these three out from Growing Power, Power Drift or Molt Augmented. Entirely up to the user. Archon Continuity is going to give me corrosive status effects whenever I apply Toxin, which is pretty much every time. I've gone for Blind Rage for ability strength, Vitality, Umbral Vitality for more health, Umbral Fiber for more armor, Umbral Intensify for ability strength as well. But if you don't have the Umbral mods, you could just use the normal variations of these, whatever it takes to get you above the armor threshold for persistence and I guess to work, so that you can have, I guess, that damage resistance from it. Then I've gone for Equilibrium for energy and health resupply, since her first ability will give you a chance to spawn in health and energy orbs. Then that's why I haven't subsumed this off and why I've gotten rid of her scuttlers instead. But you could get rid of either, again, totally depending on the user. Webbed Embrace is going to give you vulnerability status to enemies. It's also going to apply Toxin, and it's also going to make them take larger explosions. But being honest with you, I don't really use this either, because enemies, I want them clumped up and I want them moving towards me, and I don't want them actually stuck in one place. I want to be able to spread more effectively, and I guess funneling them into choke points is a much better way of doing it. So again, Growing Power, Power Drift, Archon Continuity, Blind Rage, the 3 Umbral mods, Stretch for a bit of range on Webbed Embrace. Then I've gone for Primed Flow for more energy, Equilibrium for more, I guess, sustain, and then I've gone for Persistence to give me the benefit from that whenever I get above the 700 armor, which I get simply because of Cold Elemental Ward, and then Molt Augmented for ability strength as well. But again, you can chop and change any of these. The key fundamental parts of this build is Cold Elemental Ward, while also the Diriga and also the Spinnerex as well. Now, when it comes to the weapon of choice, you can use the Verglass Prime if you wanted to. I'm using the Prime Laser Rifle, and with this, all you really need is Shivering, Contagion, and whatever elemental mods that you want to put onto it. You can ignore the Riven and put whatever you want in there. This is basically just giving me crit chance, crit damage, heat, and damage to infested. However, Continuous Misery, increasing the duration of status effects on enemies, is a nice way just to, I guess, snowball and make sure those enemies have those effects whenever everything does get spread around. But Shivering Contagion is the one where you want to to be spreading as many of those cold status approx to enemies within 6 meters as you possibly can, and this is a huge part of that. Now, when it comes to Oraxia's Spinnerex, the main part of this for this setup is melee influence, of course, to spread elements around, but then also the unique trait, which is basically if an enemy is hit by the Spinnerex within the last 5 seconds, to have a 10% chance to explode for Toxin damage. And this is going to basically increase per stack. So 10 stacks is a 100% chance to explode, and base damage is 480 Toxin, and it has a 10 meter radius. However, the wiki also mentioned that the explosion from the Spinnerex's passive is affected by melee damage buffs, elemental buffs, and faction damage buffs. So melee elementalist prime mods for the smite ones, so that you're going up against a faction, elemental mods and damage mods will amplify the damage of those explosions. But again, the main part is the trait and melee influence. Now, when it comes to the Kuva Sobek, this is pretty much, I guess, the go-to build for a lot of players when it comes to running it with Saren or running it with Oraxia, where you're focusing on status chance, you're focusing on viral, heat, multi-shot, of course, on a Bane mod, and then Acid Shells is holding it all together. On top of this, our Galvanized Acceleration will also increase the damage fall-off of my rounds, meaning I can hit enemies from further away for more damage. However, I do have a Riven, which I will be popping in instead of Shotgun Barrage, and I'll be using that instead. So you can switch that for Shotgun Barrage if you don't have a decent Sobek Riven. It is one of the few weapons in the game that I will actually use a Riven on. I don't use a Riven. I've got a lot of Rivens that I don't feckin' use that are just sitting there, but this is one of the few weapons. This and the Strun, and I guess the Latron and the Dual Toxicist are the only real weapons that I have active Rivens for that I will roll to try and get better stats on. On top of this, I also have Primary Blight, which will increase my crit damage and, of course, my multi-shot as well. Now, on top of this, my Oraxia also has 5 Tau Forged Green Shards, which are also going to increase my toxic damage by 45%. So I've got all of these on, but you could use whichever Archon Shards you have that are going to, I guess, supplement your build and fit your playstyle. Now, if you wanted to amplify the build even more and give yourself more armor and more chances of getting, I guess, health and energy orbs, then the Unairu Focus School is definitely the one that I would use with it, simply because you have a chance for shockwaves to generate universal orbs and, of course, ammo. And then on top of that, you've got the Tempered Benison node, which will basically, once you do those shockwaves, will pop out 5 armor motes, and they will grant 450 temporary armor each. And because you basically have the, I guess, the seismic impact, which gives you additional seismic slams after the initial ones just by slamming your melee weapon down, you do get quite a lot, I guess, of those little cheese slices lying around for you to pick up and float around your Warframe to give you that additional armor. So that's my Oraxia, that's the build. It's not perfect, but it is how I enjoy playing her. So you can go ahead and you can min-max her even more than the build that I've showcased and make her even more powerful. You can switch out arcanes or mods, switch them around to fit your own playstyle. And who knows, they haven't removed the interaction with melee influence and elemental ward yet for the last few months, I guess, since Oraxia came out anyway. That doesn't mean that they won't in the near future if they think that maybe it's a broken interaction or it shouldn't be the way it is. It is, I think, a really fun interaction, and it does allow you to actually use Oraxia's melee weapon, her Spinnerex, with her, because normally you can't, because once she's in her Silken Stride, she can't use a melee weapon, so it does allow you to do that. But go ahead and let me know in the comment section below if you've been using this setup on your Oraxia and what way you've changed the build compared to what I have. Maybe you've made it a little bit more tanky, a little bit more power strength. Let me know in the comment section below. Have a great day, have a great week, and as always, thanks for watching.